home is supposed to be the safest place a child knows. The locked door, the lit window at the end of the street, the adult in the next room who will come running if something goes wrong. For the girls in this video, none of that was true. Danger was not outside. It was already inside, wearing the face of a parent, sleeping in the next room, sitting at the head of the table. These girls grew up learning that the place they were supposed to feel safest was the place they had the most reason to fear. Some of them reported what was happening and were sent back. Some of them ran and were found. Some of them carried what was done to them for years, before they reached a night they could not survive any other way. The sentences they received varied wildly. Several were eventually freed by governors who concluded the original courts had never heard the full story. Today we are covering 10 of those girls. Case 1. Marlene Olive. A firefighter working a routine call at China Camp State Park in Marin County, California, on the afternoon of June 29, 1975, found what appeared at first to be the remains of an animal, smouldering in an abandoned barbecue pit near the waterline. The bones were charred. There were fragments of what had once been a rug. He called it in as a probable hunting discard and went back to his station. 2 days later, Marin County medical examiner confirmed that the remains were human. There were 2 sets of them. The investigation that followed would consume the county for the rest of that summer and produce a case that drew coverage from newspapers as far away as London and Tokyo, a case that was still being discussed in academic and artistic circles 50 years later, a case built around a 16-year-old girl, and a question the courts never fully settled. What exactly does responsibility look like when one person makes the plan and another person carries it out? James Olive was 53 years old. Everyone called him Jim. He had spent the better part of his adult life working as a business consultant for oil companies operating in Latin America, a career that paid well and required the family to live for extended periods in Ecuador. He was described by his colleagues as competent and reliable, man who showed up on time and kept his commitments, the kind of man whose disappearance from a scheduled meeting was unusual enough that his business partners noticed immediately. His wife Naomi was 46. She had followed Jim through the oil company postings and the relocations, and the years in Ecuador had not been easy on her. People who knew the family in those years described a household under pressure. There were arguments, there were stretches where Naomi was not well. The details never came out cleanly in the public record, but the testimony that emerged at trial painted a picture of a home that was stable on the outside and fraying at the centre. Marlene had been adopted by Jim and Naomi as an infant in 1959. She was born in Norfolk, Virginia, and given up by her biological mother, a single woman who did not have the means to raise her. The Olives were already in their 30s when they took Marlene home. By all accounts, the early years of the adoption were unremarkable. She grew up in the oil company compounds in Ecuador, surrounded by the children of other expatriate families, attending school in a structured and relatively insular environment. She was smart. She was restless. She was, by the time the family relocated to Terra Linda in 1973, already a teenager who had difficulty fitting into conventional expectations. And Terra Linda was not Ecuador. Terra Linda was a comfortable residential community 14 miles north of San Francisco, a place of tract homes and shopping centres and high schools, where the teenage culture of the early 1970s was in full expression. Drug use was widespread. The occult had entered the social vocabulary of the young in ways that unnerved many parents. Marlene arrived at Terra Linda High School at 14. Speaking with a slight accent from her years abroad, she found the transition genuinely difficult. The friends she made were mostly on the margins of the school's social world. She began using marijuana, She experimented with harder substances. She wrote poetry that expressed, by turns, love for her parents and a darkness she could not name. The relationship between Marlene and her mother had, by 1975, deteriorated into something closer to open warfare. Naomi's instability had worsened. Jim's efforts to hold the family together were constant and apparently exhausting. The house on Hibiscus Way was not a peaceful place. Charles Riley was 19 years old when he met Marlene. He went by Chuck. He was overweight, socially awkward, had graduated from high school without much to show for it. He sold marijuana in small quantities, mostly to peers, a way of generating income and purchasing a version of acceptance that his personality alone had not secured. He was at Terra Linda High School on the day Marlene, then 15, was lying on the front lawn in the middle of her first experience with LSD. He sat down next to her. He was taken with her immediately. She was bright and charismatic and capable of a kind of intensity that Chuck, by his own subsequent description, had never encountered in anyone close to his own age. He became her boyfriend. He became, in a more complete sense than that word usually covers, entirely devoted to her in a way that left him with very little of his own judgment intact. The relationship that developed between Marlene and Chuck over the following year and a half was documented in detail after their arrests, through Chuck's extended confession, and through the testimony of friends and acquaintances. Marlene was clearly the more dominant figure. She made decisions. He followed them. She expressed opinions. He agreed with them. When she began, in the months before June 1975, to talk openly about wanting her parents gone, Chuck was the primary audience for those conversations. Multiple teenagers who testified at trial described hearing Marlene discuss the idea of her parents being eliminated in terms that ranged from vague to specific. She was not secretive about it. She talked about it the way a person talks about a problem they are working through. Chuck later said in his confession that he heard these conversations many times over several months, that Marlene and he had discussed the idea explicitly, and that on the morning of June 21, 1975, plan was made that he would carry out that same day. Jim and Naomi Olive were home on Hibiscus Way on the afternoon of June 21. Chuck Riley arrived at the house with a hammer and a pistol. What happened inside was described in court documents, and in Chuck Riley's own words to investigators. Naomi Olive was in the sewing room. She did not survive the encounter with the hammer. James Olive returned to the house later and was shot once in the back at close range. In Riley's 2008 parole hearing statement, later cited in court documents, he described the events in blunt terms. He had gone to the house. Both of Marlene's parents had lost their lives by his hand, and the events had been carried out as the result of plans the two of them had made. That day, though Marlene had spoken with him and others about her intentions many times in the months leading up to it, the bodies were wrapped in sheets and left in the house, while Marlene and Chuck waited for darkness. When night came, they loaded the wrapped remains into Chuck's car and drove to China Camp State Park. They placed the bodies in the barbecue pit, soaked them with gasoline, and set them on fire. They drove away. They waited. A week passed. Jim Olive's business partners began trying to reach him. He had not appeared for scheduled meetings. He was not responding to messages. His office called the house. There was no answer. They contacted the police. When investigators arrived at the home on Hibiscus Way, they found rooms in disarray. No sign of either adult Olive, no sign of Marlene. She appeared at the police station later that same day and offered the first of several explanations. Parents had gone to Lake Tahoe on vacation and had not come back. When pressed, she said her father had killed her mother and run. When that account began to fall apart under questioning, She said her mother had been the one responsible. Then she told detectives that both her parents had been taken and harmed by a group connected to the Hells Angels motorcycle club. Each account contradicted the last. By the second day of questioning, Marlene had been separated from Chuck Riley, was in custody, and already providing investigators with a detailed account of everything that had happened. She led the detectives to China Camp. Chuck Riley was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in Marin County and held without bail. His trial began on October 30, 1975, ran for 7 weeks. The prosecution built its case on Chuck's confession, which was extensive and self-incriminating in virtually every detail. The defense strategy was unusual. Riley's attorneys argued that Marlene had exerted a form of psychological control over their client so complete that he had functioned essentially as an instrument of her will, that she had cast a kind of spell over him that left him unable to exercise independent moral judgment. Psychiatric testimony was offered in support of this position. The jury was not persuaded. Riley was convicted on both counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. That sentence did not survive the year. In 1976, the California Supreme Court struck down the state's death penalty statute in Rockwell v. Superior Court, and Riley's sentence was commuted to 2 concurrent terms of 25 years to life. He became eligible for parole in 1982. He was denied repeatedly for decades, in part because he continued for many years to attribute significant responsibility to Marlene rather than accepting full accountability. He was eventually released after more than 40 years behind bars. Because Marlene was 16 at the time of the crime, the legal process that applied to her was entirely different. She was processed through the juvenile justice system under Section 6602 of the California Welfare and Institutions Code, provision that covered everything from shoplifting to serious felonies, without distinguishing between them. In terms of the label applied to the offence, she was not tried for murder. She was adjudicated as a juvenile ward and sentenced to confinement at the California Youth Authority facility in Ventura with a term of 3 to 6 years. Under the terms of the juvenile system, she would be eligible for release on her 21st birthday, unless the facility determined she had not been sufficiently rehabilitated. She was released at 21, having served just over 4 years. During part of that period, she had escaped from custody and been located in New York, which extended her confinement. The disparity between a death sentence for Chuck Riley and a maximum of 6 years for Marlene Olive became one of the defining features of the case's public legacy. Legal analysts at the time pointed to it as a near-perfect illustration of the contradictions embedded in a system that treats participants in the same crime as entirely different categories of person based solely on age. The gap was not subtle, it was absolute. One person was sentenced to die. The other was scheduled for release before she could legally buy a drink. The case drew worldwide attention, in part because of the nature of the disposal of the bodies, which the San Francisco Chronicle and the Marin Independent Journal covered in sustained detail, and in part because of the photographs of Marlene Olive that appeared in those papers. A slight girl with dark hair who did not look, to most readers, a person capable of orchestrating what had happened on Hibiscus Way. The Chronicle dubbed the case the Barbecue Murders. That name persisted. Journalist Richard Levine wrote a book about the case called Bad Blood, published in 1982, which remains the most detailed account of what the family's life had looked like from the inside. The book documented the instability of Naomi Olive's mental state, the pressures Jim Olive was navigating, and the degree to which the household had become untenable in the years before the summer of 1975, Marlene Olive was released from the California Youth Authority on her 21st birthday, became of her afterward, was not a matter of public record for many years. In 2003, the artist Marlene McCarty completed a series of large-scale drawings about the case as part of a body of work she called Murder Girls. It examined the lives of teenage girls who had been involved in serious violence. One of those drawings, titled Marlene Olive, 353 Hibiscus Way, acquired by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where it remains in the permanent collection. The house on Hibiscus Way in Terra Linda still stands. Chuck Riley, having served more than 4 decades and eventually acknowledged his full responsibility for the events of June 21, 1975, was released on parole. The question of what Marlene's years inside that house had actually been like, and what the law might have owed her that it chose not to offer, has never been answered definitively. The courts did not have to answer it. Juvenile system never required that it be asked. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is set on Long Island in 1986, and the girl at its centre did not recruit an accomplice out of weakness or desperation. She recruited one out of calculation, paid him $400 in cash, and was back inside her house before the body in the driveway had been found. Case 2, Cheryl Pearson. On the morning of February 5, 1986, Cheryl Pearson let her dog out through the front door of the family home on Stonebridge Lane in Selden, quiet suburb in Suffolk County, on Long Island, New York. She already knew what she would find when she stepped outside. Her father, James Pearson Sr., 42 years old, an electrician who had worked the same service routes in Suffolk County for over a decade, lying face down in the snow of the driveway. He had been shot 5 times. A young man named Sean Peaker had been waiting behind a tree at the edge of the property with a .22 caliber rifle. Peaker had fired once into the back of James Pearson's head as he walked toward his car, then stood over him and fired 4 more rounds into the body. He had then walked away from the house through the snow. The footprints he left behind were among the first things investigators photographed when they arrived. Cheryl was 16 years old. She went back inside after she saw her father in the driveway. She had been told to do that. James Pearson Sr. had grown up in Suffolk County and spent his adult life there. He was a widower. His wife Linda had passed away from kidney disease in 1983. When Cheryl was 13, leaving James as the sole parent of 3 children. Cheryl, older brother James Jr., and her younger sister Joanne, who was 8 years old at the time of her father's death. By the accounts of neighbours and people who attended the same church as the family, the Pearsons appeared to be a household navigating grief. James was described as a devoted father who showed up to his daughter's cheerleading events, who kept the house maintained, held down steady employment, and met his obligations. Cheryl was a popular junior at Newfield High School. She had a boyfriend. She was on the cheerleading squad. She was, by the measurements available to people who did not live inside the house, normal teenager, from a normal family doing the best they could after a painful loss. What those measurements could not reach was what had been happening inside that house since Cheryl was 11 years old. In the pre-sentencing hearings that followed her arrest, Cheryl told Suffolk County Court in detail that her father had begun sexually abusing her 2 years before her mother became too ill to notice, and that the abuse had continued without interruption from that point forward. He had subjected her, in her own testimony, to repeated acts of sexual violence that escalated over time, told her that the stability of the family, the welfare of her younger siblings, and the memory of her mother all depended on her silence. She had believed him, or at minimum had been unable to find a way to act against what she believed. She had not told her boyfriend. She had not told a teacher. She had not called any of the hotlines that in 1986 were not yet widely publicized. She had held it. What broke the holding was not a crisis for Cheryl specifically, but a comment her father made about Joanne. By late 1985, James Pearson had begun making remarks that Cheryl interpreted as an indication that he intended to start abusing her younger sister. Joanne was 8, testimony and in interviews she gave years later. Cheryl described arriving at a conclusion that felt to her, at 16, like the only logical endpoint available. If her father was going to do to Joanne what he had done to her, and if the legal and social structures around her had not protected her, there was one way to ensure Joanne was never in that position. The decision was not impulsive. It developed over weeks. It was methodical in the way that decisions made by very young people with no adult support tend to be methodical, improvised, partially formed, and carried out with a directness that surprised everyone who later tried to understand it. At some point in late 1985, Cheryl had come across a news report about a woman who had arranged for her husband to be harmed. The idea stayed with her. One morning in homeroom at Newfield High School, she raised the subject in a way that was casual enough to register as conversation rather than solicitation. She asked the room whether anyone would kill someone for money. Sean Peaker, 17 at the time, and a classmate in homeroom, said he would do it for $1,000. He was not joking. She was not joking. Over the weeks that followed, arrangement moved from that exchange towards something concrete. Cheryl disclosed the abuse to Peaker as part of the conversation, explaining why she needed her father gone. She also disclosed it to her boyfriend Robert Cuccio, who had been pressing her for months to explain what was wrong. Cuccio did not try to talk her out of the plan. He helped her raise the money. The agreed payment was $1,000. Cheryl and Robert could not assemble that amount. They put together $400 between them. Robert delivered the cash to Peaker after the deed was done, not before. On the morning of February 5, 1986, Cheryl unlocked the front door, let the dog out onto the steps, and James Pearson Sr. walked down the driveway toward his car for the last time. The investigation did not take long. Within a week of the shooting, all 3 young people were in custody. Cheryl made no sustained attempt to maintain a cover story. Her attorneys moved quickly to disclose the abuse, filing pre-trial submissions that reframed the case entirely before it reached a jury. But what had begun as a murder investigation became something the Suffolk County Court had not navigated in quite this form before. Witnesses came forward at the pre-sentencing hearings to corroborate elements of Cheryl's account. Neighbours described James Pearson as a man with a volatile temper and a habit of physical contact with his daughter that struck some of them as appropriate. James Pearson's own mother told the court that she believed the allegations. Former girlfriend of James Pearson's testified about behaviour she had observed. Portrait that emerged at the hearings bore little resemblance to the man the neighbourhood had believed it knew. Cheryl and Sean Peaker entered guilty pleas to first-degree manslaughter, a charge reduced from murder in recognition of the circumstances. Peaker was sentenced first, in April 1987, by Suffolk County Court Judge Harvey Sherman. The judge sentenced him to 8 to 24 years in a state correctional facility. In his remarks from the bench, Judge Sherman told the courtroom that Peaker was not in prison for keeping a promise or for being a loyal friend. He was in prison, the judge said, for accepting money to end the life of a man he had never met. Peaker, who was 18 at sentencing, stood with his head bowed and told the judge he was sorry. Cheryl's sentencing hearing came in October 1987. It was the hearing that drew the most sustained media attention. She fainted before the judge finished reading the sentence. She was given 6 months in the Suffolk County Jail with youthful offender status, designation that sealed her criminal record and prevented the conviction from following her into adulthood, in the way a standard felony would. Robert Cuccio, who had delivered the payment to Pica, pleaded guilty to criminal solicitation and was sentenced to 5 years of probation without any period of incarceration. Cheryl served approximately 14 weeks of her 6-month sentence, receiving credit for the 2 weeks she had spent in custody before sentencing, and an additional reduction for good behaviour. She walked out of the Suffolk County Jail in January 1988. A stretch limousine was waiting for her. Trees at Robert Cuccio's house had been decorated with 102 yellow ribbons, one for each day she had been behind bars. She was wearing blue jeans and a black jacket. She told reporters she had lost 15 pounds and that she was glad it was over. She and Robert Cuccio married not long afterward. She took his surname and has used it ever since. Sean Pica served approximately 9 years before his release. He went on to found a non-profit organisation called Rehabilitation Through the Arts, which works with incarcerated people, and has received recognition from the state of New York for its programming. In a 2017 interview with People magazine, Cheryl spoke at length about her father, about the years of abuse, and about the decision she made at 16. She said she had not fully understood at the time that the solution she chose was permanent in a way that could not be revisited. She said she had not thought about it in those terms. She had thought about stopping it. The case has been revisited multiple times in the decades since, including in a 2017 episode of the Investigation Discovery series. People magazine investigates. It remains one of the most discussed cases in the literature on parricide and abuse-motivated violence, in part because the outcome was so unusual and in part because the circumstances were so completely hidden from the community around the family. James Pearson Sr. had attended church. He had shown up at his daughter's cheerleading performances. He had been in every visible register, grieving father doing his best. None of that was false, exactly. It simply was not complete. Joanne Pearson, the younger sister Cheryl had cited as her reason for acting when she did, grew up in Suffolk County. She has not spoken publicly about the case in any extended way. The house on Stonebridge Lane in Selden passed out of the family's hands in the years following the case. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to Missouri. 4 years later, the girl at its centre shot her father as he slept on the 4th of July to protect herself, and her younger sister received a mandatory life sentence and waited 18 years before a governor decided the jury had never heard the full story. Case 3. Stacey Lannert. In the early hours of July 4, 1990, Stacey Lannert came home late to the house in St. John, Missouri, a small municipality folded into the western edge of St. Louis County. She was 18 years old. Her younger sister Christy was 14. The two of them had been out together that evening and had returned after midnight, entering the house through a basement window. Because the hour was late, and they did not want to wake their father, Tom Lannert was asleep on the living room sofa. The television was on. The house was quiet, except for whatever the television was saying to no one. Stacey saw a rifle. It was a weapon she recognized, one that had been in the house for some time. She picked it up. She stood over her father, where he lay on the sofa, and shot him once. The shot struck his collarbone and startled him awake. She closed her eyes and fired again. Tom Lannert did not survive the second shot. Stacy put the rifle down. She and Christy stayed in the house through what remained of the night. The following day, Stacy called an adult friend for guidance. That friend helped her dispose of the weapon. Stacy then called the police and told them she had come home and found her father on the sofa, already gone. She told them she did not know what had happened to him. The account did not hold. Investigators found inconsistencies within hours. Within days, the story had come apart entirely, and Stacy Lannert was in custody, facing a charge of first-degree murder in St. County Circuit Court. She was 18 years old. She had no prior criminal record. She had grown up in the same county, where she was now being processed through a system that did not yet have a formal legal language for what she was about to describe. Tom Lannert had been born and raised in the St. Louis area. He worked variously over the years in construction and related trades, a physically capable man who had struggled with alcohol, and with the kind of volatility that alcohol tends to worsen for. He and Stacy's mother had divorced when Stacy was young, and the children had moved between households over the years that followed before eventually settling into a more permanent arrangement with their father. By the time Stacy was in her early teens, the household was Tom's. He set the rules. He determined when the girls came and went. He determined, in ways that went far beyond parental authority, what happened inside that house. Stacy testified at trial that Tom Lannert had begun sexually abusing her when she was 8 years old. The abuse had been ongoing for a decade by the time of his death. It had included repeated acts of rape, cost. He had warned her that disclosure would destroy the family, that no one would believe her, that the consequences of telling would fall on her rather than on him. She had internalized that warning in the way children who are told such things consistently do, not as a choice to stay silent, but as a fact of the world she was living in. She had not told her mother. She had not told teachers. She had not reported anything to authorities in the decade the abuse had been occurring. She had managed it the way she had been taught to manage it, which was to say, she had not managed it at all, but had simply endured it, year by year, until the summer of 1990, when something shifted. What shifted was Christy. Stacy had absorbed the abuse in part by believing, or needing to believe, that it was contained to her, that her endurance was purchasing her sister's safety. In the period before July 4, she had begun to understand that this was no longer true. Tom Lannert had started directing his attention to Christy. The precise nature of what Stacy observed or was told in those final weeks was part testimony at trial, though the jury was given limited instruction on how to weigh it. What is documented in the court record is that Stacy Lannert, on the night of July 4, 1990, made a decision she later described in terms of a single driving logic. Her father was not going to do to Christy what he had done to her. The only way she could ensure that with certainty was to ensure he could not do anything at all. The trial in St. Louis County Circuit Court in 1992 was, by the account of observers and later legal analysts, proceeding from which the most relevant evidence was largely absent. Missouri law at the time did not recognize battered woman syndrome as an established legal defense, and the judge's instructions to the jury did not permit the abuse history to be considered as a mitigating factor in the way Stacy's attorneys had hoped. The jury heard that she had been abused. They were told by the judge's instruction this could not constitute the kind of imminent threat required to support a self-defense claim, because Tom Lannert had been asleep at the time of the shooting. There was no immediate danger in the legal sense the instruction required. The abuse, however prolonged and however documented, did not meet the threshold the law had drawn. The jury convicted Stacy Lannert of first-degree murder, Under Missouri law at the time, the conviction carried a mandatory sentence. On December 11th, 1992, Judge Robert Goldman sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of probation or parole. He also imposed a concurrent 3-year term for armed criminal action. In his remarks from the bench, the judge acknowledged that the mandatory nature of the sentence troubled him given the circumstances of the case. He sentenced her anyway, because the law gave him no other option. Stacy Lannert entered the Missouri correctional system at 20 years old. She would spend the next 18 years there. During that time, she worked steadily at whatever programming the institution offered. She completed educational courses. She became a certified dog trainer through a prison program that paired inmates with shelter animals. She began working with other incarcerated women who had histories of abuse, running informal support groups that eventually attracted the attention of outside advocates. She was, by every measure used to evaluate inmates for eventual release, a model prisoner. She was also, by every measure available to her attorneys and to the legal analyst who examined her case over the years, someone whose conviction rested on a trial that had been structurally prevented from hearing the most important evidence. Appeals were filed and denied at the state level. Federal courts declined to intervene. Her attorneys took to 3 different Missouri governors over the years, each time arguing that the mandatory sentencing structure had produced an outcome that did not reflect the actual facts of what had happened in that house over the decade before July 4, 1990. The first 2 governors did not act. The third was Matt Blunt, Republican, serving the final days of his term in January 2009. Blunt announced on January 10, 2009, that he was commuting the sentences of 2 Missouri women who had been convicted of taking the lives of men who had subjected them to sustained sexual abuse. One was Stacy Lannert. The other was a woman named Charity Carey, whose circumstances were similar. In his statement, Blunt said he had conducted an exhaustive review of the facts in both cases and had determined that both women had suffered extensive abuse before taking the actions that led to their convictions, and that the sentences imposed did not adequately reflect that history. Stacy Lannert's sentence was commuted to 20 years, a figure that, given the time she had already served, made her immediately eligible for conditional release. She walked out of the Missouri correctional system on January 16, 2009. She was 36 years old. She had entered the system at 20. She had spent the years between those ages in a place that was not built for people like her, trying to build something out of what the institution allowed. In the years following her release, Stacy Lannert completed a bachelor's degree in psychology from Southeast Missouri State University and went on to obtain a law degree. She became a licensed attorney and took a position as a public defender in St. Louis, representing clients who moved through the same system that had once processed her. She also founded an organization called Healing Sisters, non-profit resource for survivors of sexual abuse, which she has run since her release and which has connected hundreds of women with legal and therapeutic support. Christy Lanner, the younger sister whose safety Stacy cited as the reason she acted when she did, has spoken publicly about the case on a limited number of occasions. She has confirmed the abuse history once. She has said that what her sister did that night was not something she has ever been able to condemn. The house in St. John, Missouri, Tom Lannert was found on the sofa on the morning of July 5, 1990, is his private residence. The case appears in the curriculum of several Missouri law school courses as an example of how mandatory sentencing structures can produce outcomes the sentencing judge himself acknowledged were unjust and of how long it can take a legal system to find a mechanism to correct what the original trial could not weigh. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is set in Nashville, Tennessee in 2004. A 16-year-old girl had been trafficked for months before the night a man picked her up from a Sonic drive-in, drove her to his house, and did not survive the encounter. The life sentence she received for what happened in that house took 15 years and a national clemency campaign to undo. Case 4. Cyntoia Brown. On the night of August 6, 2004, a 16-year-old girl named Cyntoia Brown was picked up from the parking lot of a Sonic drive-in on Murfreesboro Pike in Nashville, Tennessee, by a 43-year-old real estate agent named Johnny Mitchell Allen. Allen paid for sex with her and drove her back to his house on Moss Dales Drive in a residential neighborhood on the south side of the city. What happened inside that house in the early hours of August 7 became the subject of a trial, a life sentence, a national clemency campaign, PBS documentary, and eventually a decision by a Tennessee governor that acknowledged something the original jury had not been positioned to weigh. Cyntoia Brown had not chosen to be in that parking lot. She had not chosen the circumstances that put her there. To understand how she arrived at the Sonic on Murfreesboro Pike that night, it is necessary to go back further than the night itself, back to a childhood that had been structured by failures at every level that should have caught her. Cyntoia was born in January 1988 in Nashville. Biological mother, Georgina Mitchell, was 19 years old at the time of her birth, and was already deep into patterns of substance use that define the years ahead. Mitchell drank heavily throughout the pregnancy. Court documents filed during Cyntoia's subsequent legal proceedings and a psychological evaluation submitted during her appeals established that Cyntoia was born with fetal alcohol syndrome, a condition that causes structural changes to the developing brain, particularly in the areas that govern impulse control, emotional regulation, and the capacity to assess risk. The jury that convicted Cyntoia in 2006 never heard this evidence. It was not disclosed until a documentary filmmaker obtained the relevant records in 2011, and a 2014 appeal brought it formally before the court. Cyntoia was eventually adopted by a woman named Elinette Brown, who gave her a stable home and a new surname, and, by all accounts, genuinely different environment from the one her biological mother had provided. The damage done in utero and in the earliest months of her life had already shaped how she processed the world. She struggled in school. She ran away from home in her early teens. She found herself at 15, homeless in Nashville and entirely without adult protection. The man who found her in that condition called himself Cutthroat. His legal name was Garyon McLaughlin. He was a drug dealer who operated in the Nashville area and who immediately identified Cyntoia as someone he could exploit. He moved her into his orbit, provided her with housing and food, and the chemical management of her anxiety, and within weeks had begun forcing her to have sex with men for money. He told her what to charge. He took what she earned. He was violent with her in the way that men who run such operations are violent, consistently enough to establish the terms of the relationship, and in ways that she had no mechanism to escape. She was 15 years old and living in a city in which no institution had successfully identified her as someone in need of intervention. By August 2004, Cyntoia had been in McLaughlin's operation for several months. Johnny Allen picked her up from the Sonic parking lot on the evening of August 6. He was 43. He drove her to his house on Mossdale Drive. Inside the house, Cyntoia later testified she saw a gun cabinet in the bedroom. Allen brought her into the room, and the two of them were in bed together when Cintoya, according to her account, saw Alan reach under the bed towards something she believed was a weapon. She reached into her purse, retrieved a loaded handgun she had been carrying for her own protection, and shot Alan once in the back of the head. He did not survive. Cintoya took Alan's wallet before she left the house. She drove away in his truck. She was found by Nashville police later that day and arrested, 16 years old. The prosecution's account of what had happened in that house was different from Cintoya's in one significant respect. Prosecutors argued that Cintoya had not shot Alan in fear for her life, but had gone to his house with the intention of robbing him, and that the shooting was a deliberate act carried out to prevent him from identifying her afterward. They pointed to the fact that she had taken his wallet as evidence of the robbery motive. The defense argued that the wallet was taken impulsively after the shooting, that Cintoya had been in genuine fear at the moment she fired, and that her entire situation as a trafficked teenager living under the control of a violent pimp was the necessary context without which the events that night could not be understood. The jury did not hear the fetal alcohol syndrome evidence. They did not hear a comprehensive account of the trafficking. The trial lasted a matter of days. In August 2006, Cintoya Brown was convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. She was 16 at the time of the offence and 17 when she was arrested, but she had been tried as an adult. In October 2006, she was sentenced to life in prison. Under Tennessee law, the sentence carried a mandatory minimum of 51 years before she would be eligible to apply for parole, meaning she would be 67 years old before the state would formally consider releasing her. The Tennessee Supreme Court considered a challenge to the sentence in 2012, and again in later years. The legal landscape around juvenile sentencing shifted nationally following a series of United States Supreme Court decisions. Tennessee prosecutors argue in the state courts asserted that the sentence did not violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment because it technically included a possibility of parole, even at 51 years. The courts accepted that argument. Cintoya remained in the Tennessee Prison for Women in Nashville. The case entered the national conversation in a significant way in 2011. Filmmaker Daniel Berman produced a documentary about Cintoya for PBS that drew wide viewership and introduced her situation to audiences outside the legal community. The documentary disclosed, for the first time in a public forum, the fetal alcohol syndrome evidence, trafficking history in detail, and the circumstances of her childhood. It also presented Cintoya herself as a person who had used her years of incarceration to transform the conditions of her own interior life. She had completed her GED. She was working toward a college degree through a program run by Lipscomb University inside the prison. She was in the assessment of every mental health professional who evaluated her during the appeals process, no longer the person she had been on the night of August 6, 2004, which was itself a statement about the person she had been forced to become by then. The clemency campaign that developed around her case drew in celebrities including Kim Kardashian West, Rihanna, LeBron James, and Ashley Judd, each of whom used their platforms to call on Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam to act. Thousands of people signed petitions. Tennessee congressmen introduced federal legislation aimed at strengthening protections for minors who are victims of sex trafficking. A hashtag carrying her name circulated widely in 2017 and again in 2018. In May 2018, the Tennessee Parole Board held a clemency hearing that ended in a split decision, with 2 members voting for clemency, 2 against, 2 recommending parole eligibility after 25 years rather than 51. The decision went to the governor without a clear recommendation. On January 7, 2019, Governor Bill Haslam, in the final days of his term, granted Cyntoia Brown clemency. In his statement, Haslam wrote that Cyntoia had committed a crime by her own admission at the age of 16, and that imposing a sentence requiring her to serve at least 51 years before any consideration of release was too harsh given the extraordinary steps she had taken to rebuild her life. He commuted her sentence, subject to conditions including regular counselling and a minimum of 50 hours of community service with at-risk youth. She would be released to parole supervision on August 7, 2019, exactly 15 years to the day from the date of her original arrest. Cyntoia Brown walked out of the Tennessee Prison for Women on August 7, 2019. She was 31 years old. She had spent half of her life behind bars. She married her longtime partner, musician Jay Long, shortly after her release, and changed her name to Cyntoia Brown Long. She published a memoir, enrolled in graduate school, and became an active voice in criminal justice reform, speaking specifically about the treatment of trafficking survivors within the legal system. She has testified before state legislatures and spoken at universities. She has said publicly that she does not consider herself fully free of what happened to her, that the years inside the prison are not erasable, and that the work of rebuilding is ongoing in ways that do not end at the prison gate. Johnny Mitchell Allen's family maintained throughout the legal proceedings that he had not been involved in trafficking, and that the circumstances of his death had been mischaracterized. His house on Mossdale Drive in Nashville was sold after his death. Sonic Drive-In on Murfreesboro Pike, where he picked up a 16-year-old girl on the evening of August 6, 2004, is still in operation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. The next case moves to Warren, Ohio, in 2016. The danger was not a trafficker or a stranger. It was on the living room couch every night, and a 14-year-old girl had already told relatives she was afraid. Her father was going to kill her mother, and then the rest of the family. They sent her back. Case 5, Brescia Meadows. In the early morning hours of July 28, 2016, police in Warren, Ohio, responded to a call from a residential address on Crest Drive in Trumbull County. The caller reported that a man had been shot inside the home. When officers arrived, they found Jonathan Meadows, 41 years old, lying on the living room couch with a single gunshot wound to the head. He had been shot with his own .45 caliber handgun. His wife Brandy was in the house. Their 3 children were in the house. The youngest of those children, 14-year-old Brescia Meadows, was taken into custody that morning and transported to the Trumbull-Conde County Juvenile Detention Center in Warren. She was charged with aggravated murder, a charge that in Ohio carried, for a juvenile tried as an adult, possibility of life without parole. Brescia Meadows was 14 years old. She was, by the account of her mother, her siblings, extended family, and the attorneys who would come to represent her, a girl who had spent most of her conscious life inside a household where violence was not an occasional event but a permanent condition. The night of July 27 into July 28 was not an escalation, was an endpoint reached after years of accumulation that the people inside that house had been unable to stop, and that the institutions around them had been unable or unwilling to interrupt. Jonathan Meadows had grown up in the Warren area and had married Brandy when they were both young. By the account of Brandy Meadows, given in multiple interviews following her daughter's arrest, violence began early in the marriage and never stopped. Jonathan was physically abusive toward her on a sustained and regular basis, controlling in the way that domestic violence researchers describe as coercive control. He monitored where Brandy went, required her to remain physically close to him, and enforced his authority over her movements. Through the threat and the regular application of force, the children grew up watching this. They grew up inside it. The older children, a son and a daughter, both in their late teens by 2016, had witnessed years of their father's violence against their mother. Brescia, the youngest, had witnessed it for her entire remembered life. Brandy Meadows told the Cleveland Plain dealer in the days after the shooting that she had watched her youngest daughter as she grew older, as though the accumulation of years inside that house was a weight that increased rather than normalized. She used that word specifically, deteriorate. She said Drescher had grown increasingly distressed, increasingly frightened, increasingly unable to function in the way a child is supposed to function when the place she returns to every day is safe. Brescia was a student at a local middle school. Her teachers and classmates would later describe a girl who was quiet and withdrawn in ways that registered as shyness from the outside. What was happening on the inside was something the school had no mechanism to see. 2 months before the shooting, in late May 2016, Brescia ran away from home. She did not run aimlessly. She ran to specific people, relatives who she believed would understand what she was trying to tell them. When she reached them, post, she told them she was afraid her father was going to kill her mother, and then kill the rest of the family. She said she believed this with the certainty of someone who has lived inside a situation long enough to understand its trajectory. Relatives contacted the relevant authorities. There is documentation of this contact in the court record. The response that came back was insufficient to change anything in the house on Crest Drive. Brescia was returned home. Jonathan Meadows was still there when she arrived. The 2 months between that return and the night of July 27 are not comprehensively documented in public record. What is documented is the pattern that had preceded them and the event that ended them. On the night of July 27, Jonathan Meadows was on the living room couch. His wife was on the floor beside him, as she often was, because he required her proximity, even in sleep, and enforced that requirement through the dynamics of a relationship that had long since moved beyond any ordinary understanding of marriage. The older children were in the house. Brescia was in the house. At some point in the early hours of July 28, Brescia Meadows picked up her father's .45 caliber handgun, walked to the living room, and shot him once in the head as he slept. She did not fire again. One shot. Jonathan Meadows was 41 years old. He had been the defining force in his family's life for as long as his children could remember, and the defining force had been fear. Police arrived. Brescia was taken into custody without resistance. She was 14 years old, small for her age, and she did not try to explain herself to the officers who put her in the patrol car. There would be time for explaining later, through attorneys and courts, and a process that would take the better part of 2 years, and draw national attention to a case that her advocates argued was not a murder case at all, but a survival case that the charging statutes had no category for. The decision about how to charge Brescia Meadows fell to the Trumbull County Prosecutor's Office under Chief Prosecuting Attorney Elkins. The initial charge was aggravated murder, the most serious homicide charge available under Ohio law. The question that immediately arose, that would dominate the case for the following months, was whether Brescia would be tried as a juvenile or bound over to adult court, where a conviction on aggravated murder could result in a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Ohio law at the time permitted the prosecution of children as young as 14 as adults for serious offences. Elkins's office indicated early on that they were evaluating whether to pursue that path. What followed was one of the more visible juvenile justice campaigns in recent American history. Brescia's family retained Cleveland attorney Ian Friedman, whose prior cases included high-profile juvenile matters, and who immediately framed the case in terms of self-defense and defense of others rather than murder. Friedman told reporters in the days after the arrest that this was a classic case of a battered woman situation as it applied to the mother, and that Brescia and her siblings had witnessed this every day of their lives until a point was reached where one of them concluded that the only opportunity to defend the family had arrived. He was direct about the framing. He was also direct about the stakes. If Brescia was tried as an adult and convicted, she would potentially spend the rest of her life in prison for shooting a man who had spent decades terrorizing the people he was legally obligated to protect. The public response to the case was significant and swift. A campaign called Free Brescia emerged in the fall of 2016, organized by activists, legal advocates, and domestic violence organizations who argued that Brescia's prosecution was an example of a justice system consistently failed to protect black women and girls from abuse, and then prosecuted them when they acted in defense of themselves and their families. Rallies were held in several cities. A GoFundMe campaign raised more than $100,000 for Brescia's legal defense. Case drew coverage in national outlets and was cited repeatedly in academic and policy discussions about the intersection of juvenile justice, domestic violence, and racial disparity in prosecution decisions. Brandy Meadows spoke publicly and consistently in support of her daughter throughout this period. She said at multiple points that Brescia had saved her life, and that the family had been living in conditions that she had tried and failed to escape over many years. Documentation of prior domestic violence, calls to the Crest Drive address, emerged during the pretrial period. Brandy confirmed that she had filed for a protective order against Jonathan years earlier and had later withdrawn it, decision she attributed to the dynamics of a relationship in which withdrawal of legal protection was itself a form of coercion. Pattern was familiar to anyone who worked in the domestic violence field. It was not familiar to the general public in the way it needed to be for a 14-year-old girl not to end up in a juvenile detention centre on an aggravated murder charge. Brescia remained in the Trumbull County Juvenile Detention Centre for the first 10 months following her arrest. December 2016, Elkins's office announced that they would not pursue the case in adult court and would proceed in juvenile jurisdiction. This was a significant development. It meant that Brescia's maximum possible sentence, even on the most serious charge, confinement until her 21st birthday. It did not resolve the case. It changed the ceiling of what the case could do to her. Trial date was set for May 22, 2017. In the weeks before that date, Elkins's office and Friedman's team negotiated the terms of a plea agreement. The agreement that was reached and formalized in May 2017 reduced the charge from aggravated murder to involuntary manslaughter. Brescia entered a plea of true, the juvenile court equivalent of a guilty plea, in accordance with the agreement. The terms included a total of 18 months in custody, with credit for the 10 months she had already served, and the remaining time to be spent, not in a detention facility, but at the Belfair JCB Residential Treatment Centre, therapeutic facility, where she would receive trauma-focused mental health treatment. Friedman described the outcome as one that had started with the potential of life without parole, and arrived at a place where a traumatized 14-year-old girl would receive treatment rather than punishment. and where her record would be sealed when she turned 21, so that she could enter adulthood without the conviction following her. He said at the hearing that Brescia had smiled genuinely for the first time in months when she understood the terms, and that she had begun for the first time to talk about her future. Brescia Meadows was released from the Belfair Treatment Centre in February 2018. Approximately 19 months after her arrest, she was 16 years old. She returned to her family. Her mother and siblings had remained in contact throughout her confinement, attending hearings and maintaining the relationships that the detention and the treatment process had interrupted, but not severed. Case was sealed in accordance with the agreement, meaning that the formal legal record became inaccessible to the public when Brescia reached adulthood. The case did not disappear from the broader conversation. Legal scholars and policy advocates continued to cite it in discussions about how the justice system processes children who act in response to sustained domestic violence, and about the racial dimensions of those prosecutions. 2017 report by the advocacy organisation Survived and Punished used Brescia's case as a central example of what the organisation described as the criminalisation of survival, a pattern in which women and girls who respond to abuse with force are prosecuted with the same legal tools designed for predatory offenders, without any formal recognition of the context that produced the response. Brandy Meadows has spoken in the years since about the difficulty of the period, both before and after the shooting. She has said that the abuse Jonathan subjected the family to was real and sustained, and that she had tried on multiple occasions to find a way out that did not require what her daughter ultimately did. She has also said that the system failed her family at every point where it had an opportunity to intervene, from the protective order she felt coerced into withdrawing, to the response to Brescia's May 2016 disclosure to relatives, to the years of prior domestic violence calls that produced no lasting change in the conditions of the house on Crest Drive. Jonathan Meadows' family contested several of the characterizations made by Brandy and by Brescia's legal team during the public phase of the case. His brother James Blount gave interviews in the days after the shooting in which he said Jonathan drank occasionally, but was not a violent man and would have given his life for his children. He said the shooting was cold and calculated. Two accounts of who Jonathan Meadows was do not fully reconcile in the public record. What is documented is the single domestic violence filing prior calls to the address, Brescia's May 2016 disclosure to relatives, and the circumstances of the night of July 28 as established at the plea hearing. Jonathan Meadows was 41 years old when he died on the couch in the living room of the house on Crest Drive. He had 4 children. 3 of them were in the house on the night he was shot. The youngest of those 3 was 14 years old, and she had run away from him 2 months earlier and told relatives she was afraid he was going to kill her mother and then kill the rest of them. She was sent back. She went back. She waited 2 more months. The house on Crest Drive in Warren, Ohio, is a private residence, Trumbull County Courthouse, where Brescia's hearings were held, still processes juvenile cases at roughly the same volume it did in 2016 and 2017. Belfair JCB Residential Treatment Center in Cleveland, where Brescia spent the latter portion of her confinement, continues to operate as a therapeutic facility for young people in crisis. Brescia Meadows, whose legal record was sealed when she turned 21, has not spoken publicly about the case in any extended way since her release. She is, as of this recording, young adult, living a life the terms of her agreement were specifically designed to allow her to build. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case begins in Iowa with a 15-year-old girl who had already tried to leave before the worst of it happened. She ran from her adoptive home, ended up sleeping in the hallways of an apartment building, and was taken in by a man who understood immediately what her desperation was worth to him. Case 6. Piper Lewis. In the early morning hours of June 1, 2020, a 15-year-old girl named Piper Lewis stabbed a 37-year-old man named Zachary Brooks 30 times in his apartment in Des Moines, Iowa. She used a knife she found on the nightstand beside his bed. Brooks had fallen asleep after assaulting her. She did not plan what she did in any premeditated sense. She reached for the knife in a state that her attorneys would later describe as a culmination of months of fear, captivity, and repeated violation, and she did not stop until she stopped. She then left the apartment, walked out into the early morning air of a Des Moines residential street, tried to figure out where to go next. She had been 15 years old for less than a month. She had been living inside a trafficking situation for the better part of the prior year. She had run away from home in the first place because the home she was running from had been its own kind of danger. The night of June 1 was not the beginning of Piper Lewis's story. It was a point near the end of a chapter that had started long before she ever Zachary Brooks's name. Piper Lewis was born in September 2004 and grew up in the Des Moines area. Details of her early childhood that emerged through court filings and media reporting describe a home environment that was, by the time she reached her early teens, genuinely unsafe. Her adoptive mother's household was characterized in testimony and in Piper's own written plea agreement as abusive, a place where Piper experienced treatment that made remaining there feel more dangerous than whatever the alternative might be. She was not dramatic about this in her public statements. She was matter-of-fact in the way that young people who have normalized difficult conditions tend to be matter-of-fact. She had grown up in those conditions. They were not exceptional to her. They were simply what home meant. At some point in 2019, when Piper was 14 years old, she left. She did not have a plan. She did not have resources. She did not have a network of adults who could absorb her. She ended up sleeping in the common areas of an apartment building in Des Moines, the hallways, using whatever warmth the building provided and whatever food she could access. She was a 14-year-old girl alone in a building with no legal status as a resident, no adult protection, and no clear path toward either returning to the home she had left or building something new. The man who found her in that building was 28 years old. His name was not released publicly because he was never charged with a crime in connection with what followed, a fact that became one of the more discussed elements of the case in subsequent years. Brought Piper into his apartment. He provided food and shelter. Within a short period, he made clear what the arrangement would require from her. He began forcing her to have sex with other men in exchange for money. He was the intermediary. He set the prices. He managed the logistics. Piper was the product. She was 14 years old when this arrangement began, and she had no realistic mechanism to exit it. The man who had taken her in was also the man who controlled her housing, her food, and her physical safety. Leaving him meant returning to the hallways, or returning to the home she had already judged to be more dangerous than the hallways. Neither option presented itself as a genuine escape. Zachary Brooks was one of the men this arrangement produced. He was 37 years old, resident of Des Moines, and according to Piper's plea agreement and subsequent statements to investigators, he had paid for sex with her on multiple occasions in the weeks before June 1, 2020. Each of those occasions was, by any legal definition available in Iowa and under federal law, an act of rape. Pieper was 15 years old. She could not consent to commercial sex acts under Iowa law, regardless of any other circumstance. Prosecutors, who later handled her case, confirmed explicitly that they did not dispute the claim that she had been sexually assaulted. They disputed what she had done in response to it. On the night of May 31 into June 1, 28-year-old man sent Pieper to Brooks's apartment. He was armed when he directed her to go, using a knife to enforce the instruction, according to Pieper's account in her plea agreement. She went to the apartment. Brooks assaulted her again. Afterward, he fell asleep. Pieper found the knife on the nightstand. She stabbed him 30 times. She was, by her own subsequent description, not in a state of cold calculation. She was in a state of accumulated rage and terror that had been building for months, and that discharged in those minutes beside a sleeping man who had paid money to rape a child. She left the apartment. She was arrested the following day, June 2, 2020, taken into custody by Des Moines police. She was charged with first-degree murder, the most serious homicide charge under Iowa law, carrying a potential sentence of life in prison. She was 15 years old at the time of her arrest and was held at the Polk County Juvenile Detention Center while prosecutors determined how to proceed. The decision about how to try Pieper Lewis was not made quickly. She spent 2 years in the Juvenile Detention Center, while the legal process worked through the questions her case raised. In June 2021, nearly a year after her arrest, she entered a guilty plea to 2 reduced charges: voluntary manslaughter and willful injury. Each charge was a Class C felony under Iowa law, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. First-degree murder charge was dropped as part of the plea agreement. Plea agreement also included Pieper's written account of the circumstances that led to the killing, an account that prosecutors never disputed in its essential facts. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for September 2022. By that point, Pieper was 17 years old, had been in juvenile detention for more than 2 years, and had become, through no effort of her own, one of the most publicly discussed cases of the intersection between sex trafficking and juvenile justice in recent American memory. Advocates for trafficking survivors, juvenile justice reformers, and legal scholars had been following the case closely since the plea. A specific provision of Iowa law that governed her situation was a point of significant public debate. Iowa, unlike some other states, had not enacted a safe harbor law, providing legal protection to trafficking victims for offences committed as a direct result of their exploitation. Safe Harbor Bill had passed the Iowa House of Representatives in the legislative session prior to Pieper's sentencing, and had stalled in the Senate. Pieper Lewis's case was cited in the debate around that bill by advocates on both sides. On September 13, 2022, Pieper Lewis stood before Polk County District Judge David Porter in Des Moines for her sentencing hearing. She gave an allocution statement to the court in her own words. That was widely reported afterward for its directness and composure. She spoke about what had happened to her, about the choices she had made and the choices that had been made for her, and about what she hoped her life would look like on the other side of whatever the judge decided. Judge Porter sentenced her to 5 years of closely supervised probation and deferred the underlying sentences on both charges, meaning that as long as she successfully completed probation, the prison terms would not be imposed. He also ordered her to pay $150,000 in restitution to the family of Zachary Brooks. Restitution order drew immediate and sustained public reaction. The requirement that a trafficking victim pay the family of her alleged rapist a six-figure sum was described by advocates and legal scholars as a profound illustration of the gap between the letter of Iowa's restitution statutes and any common-sense understanding of justice. Iowa's restitution law at the time required that courts consider the impact on the victim's family without a specific exception for cases in which the person who caused the death was themselves a crime victim. Judge Porter acknowledged the difficulty of the order in his remarks, but said the law, as written, gave him no other option. $150,000 figure was not symbolic. It was a legally enforceable debt attached to a 17-year-old girl who had been homeless and trafficked for most of the prior 2 years. Pieper was released from the Juvenile Detention Center and placed in the Fresh Start Women's Center, a residential corrections facility in Des Moines, where she was to serve her probation under close supervision. In November 2022, approximately 6 weeks after her sentencing, she cut off her electronic monitoring device and walked away from the facility at 6:19 in the morning. She was 18 years old by this point. The Iowa Department of Corrections issued a warrant for her arrest. She was found in Des Moines approximately 2 weeks later and taken into custody. She was transferred to a county jail while the court determined how to respond to the probation violation. The violation changed the legal landscape of her case significantly. Under the terms of her plea and the deferred sentencing structure, probation violation opened the door to imposition of the underlying sentences that had been deferred at the September 2022 hearing. Her attorneys appeared before Judge Porter and argued for a second chance at probation, citing the circumstances of her flight and the ongoing trauma she was managing. The judge granted a second probation term with stricter conditions, but made clear in his remarks that a further violation would result in the imposition of the full prison sentences. He told her explicitly that there would not be a third opportunity. Pieper Lewis violated probation again in 2024. The circumstances of the second violation involved additional criminal conduct that prosecutors documented in the revocation proceedings returned to court. This time, Judge Porter imposed the underlying sentences. On May 3, 2024, Pieper Lewis was sentenced to 20 years in prison, 2 consecutive 10-year terms, one for the voluntary manslaughter conviction and one for the willful injury conviction. She received credit for all days previously served, which reduced the total time remaining. But the sentence was real, and it was imposed, and she was transported to an Iowa correctional facility to begin serving it. The trajectory of her case, from the 2022 sentencing to the 2024 prison term, drew sustained commentary from the advocates who had followed it. Some argued that the leniency of the original sentence had been appropriate given the circumstances, and that subsequent violations reflected the degree to which Pieper had never received the sustained therapeutic support her trauma required. Others argued that the legal system had extended significant mercy in 2022, and that the violations could not be indefinitely excused regardless of the underlying history. The debate did not resolve cleanly because the facts did not resolve cleanly. Pieper Lewis was a trafficking victim who had been failed by every institution that should have protected her before she ever encountered Zachary Brooks. She was also a person who made choices inside a legal framework that had already bent substantially in her direction, and who ultimately exhausted the tolerance of the court that had tried to accommodate her. Zachary Brooks was 37 years old when he was stabbed in his Des Moines apartment. Iowa prosecutors confirmed in their filings that they did not dispute that he had sexually assaulted Pieper Lewis. he was never charged with any offence in connection with those assaults, because he was not alive to be charged, and because Iowa's legal framework at the time did not provide a clear mechanism for pursuing posthumous accountability for a trafficking client. The 28-year-old man who had trafficked Piper, who had used a knife to force her to go to Brooks's apartment on the night of May 31, was never charged with any crime in connection with what happened to her during the months of her exploitation. He was referenced in court documents as an unnamed individual. He remained unnamed and uncharged throughout the entire legal proceeding against the 15-year-old girl he had been selling. The restitution order of $150,000 remained in place as of the time of Piper 2024 sentencing. Her attorneys had argued for its removal or reduction at various points in the proceedings. The court declined to eliminate it. It was attached to her sentence as an ongoing obligation. Iowa enacted a safe harbor law for trafficking victims in 2023, 1 year after Piper Lewis's original sentencing hearing. The law provides legal protection for trafficking victims for offences committed as a direct result of their exploitation, and creates diversion pathways that could, if applied to Piper's circumstances, produced a fundamentally different outcome. It was enacted too late to apply to her case. Kurtz, who pushed for the law, cited her case in nearly every public forum in which they argued for its passage. The bill that passed the Iowa Senate in 2023 was not identical to the one that had stalled in 2022, but it was close. The difference between the two legislative sessions, measured in practical terms, was a teenage girl's freedom. Polk County Juvenile Detention Center in Des Moines, where Piper spent more than 2 years of her adolescence, continues to house young people awaiting resolution of serious charges. The apartment building in Des Moines, where she spent nights in the hallways before the 28-year-old man took her in, is an unremarkable residential structure in a mid-sized Midwestern city. The nightstand in Zachary Brooks's apartment, where the knife was resting when Nightwolf Lust's Piper Lewis reached for it in the early hours of June 1, 2020, has no particular significance to anyone who was not in that room. The girl who reached for it was 15 years old, had been raped multiple times by the man sleeping beside her, had been trafficked for months by a man who had forced her to come to that apartment at knife point, and had run away from home in the first place because home had not been safe enough to stay in. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case travels to Kenosha, Wisconsin, where a 17-year-old girl had been exploited since she was 16 by a man the police were already investigating for child sexual assault at the time she shot him. He had never been arrested. The state of Wisconsin spent the next 6 years pursuing a life sentence against her anyway. Case 7. Christul Kaiser. On the morning of June 5, 2018, a 17-year-old girl named Christul Kaiser travelled from Milwaukee to the city of Kenosha, Wisconsin, a distance of roughly 35 miles along the western shore of Lake Michigan. She had a gun in her purse that her boyfriend had given her for protection. She went to the home of a 34-year-old man named Randall Vola III on South Sheridan Road in Kenosha. She had been to that house before. She had been there many times. What happened during those prior visits was the reason she had the gun, and the reason she used it. Christul shot Randall Vola once in the head. She then set a fire in the house and left in his BMW, taking his computer and a quantity of cash. She drove back toward Milwaukee. She was arrested 2 days later. She was charged with first-degree intentional homicide, arson, theft of a motor vehicle, possession of a firearm by a person under 18, and bail jumping, first-degree intentional homicide in Wisconsin carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison. Crystal Kaiser was 17 years old. The state of Wisconsin spent the next 6 years pursuing that life sentence against her. What the state of Wisconsin also knew, from the moment her case entered the system, was that Randall Vola III had been under active police investigation for child sexual exploitation at time Crystal shot him. Kenosha police had received a tip about Vola in early 2018 and had opened an investigation that included surveillance of property and the identification of multiple underage girls who had been to his home. Investigators had obtained and reviewed video recordings from Vola's devices that documented him sexually assaulting minors. They had been building a case against him for months. The case against Randall Vola was closed when Crystal Kaiser closed it for them, and the state of Wisconsin's responded by charging the teenager he had been abusing with the crime of ending his life. Crystal Kaiser grew up in Milwaukee. She was born in 2000 and raised in circumstances that offered her limited protection from the kind of predator Randall Vola represented. Her family struggled with the overlapping pressures that concentrated poverty produces in a mid-sized Midwestern city, and by the time Crystal was in her mid-teens, she was navigating significant portions of her daily life without the adult supervision that might have identified the danger she was moving toward. She was 16 years old when she first encountered Vola through Backpage, a website that federal authorities would later seize for facilitating prostitution and sex trafficking. Vola had placed advertisements on the site. Crystal responded to one of them. What began as a commercial transaction became, over the following year and a half, a sustained pattern of sexual exploitation. Vola paid Crystal for sex. He also, according to the evidence that investigators found on his devices, filmed those encounters without her knowledge or consent. He sold access to her to other men. He groomed her in the specific way that traffickers with resources groom teenage girls from vulnerable backgrounds. Through money, through attention, through the kind of material provision that functions as a substitute for stability, when stability is what the girl is missing. By the time Crystal was 17, she had been in Vola's orbit for more than a year. The Kenosha Police Department had been watching Vola for months and had documented his conduct on video. There were recordings of him sexually assaulting Crystal. There were recordings of him with other underage girls. The investigators who reviewed those recordings knew exactly what Vola was doing and to whom he was doing it. They were in the process of building a prosecutable case when Crystal arrived at his house on the morning of June 5, 2018, and made their investigation unnecessary. The precise sequence of events inside the house on South Sheridan Road on that morning was reconstructed by investigators from the physical evidence, from Crystal's subsequent statements, and from the findings at the scene. Vola and Crystal had been together in the house. At some point, Vola gave Crystal a drug, according to her account. Two of them decided to watch a movie. Vola fell asleep. Crystal shot him. She then moved through the house, set the fire, took the BMW and the computer and the cash, and left. Her account of the specific moment of the shooting described a state of accumulated exhaustion, anger, that had reached a point where she could no longer remain inside the dynamic Vola had created around her. She told the Washington's Wanton Post, a 2019 interview, that she had gotten upset, that she was tired of him, and that the word tired carried more weight than it might appear to in that sentence. She was arrested on June 7, 2018. Bail was initially set at $1 million, a figure that is typically reserved for defendants considered extreme flight risks or public safety threats. It was later reduced to $400,000, which was eventually posted by a coalition of bail funds and advocacy organizations that had taken up her case. She was released on bail and awaited trial in the community while her legal team prepared her defense. The defense strategy that Crystal's attorneys developed was grounded in a specific provision of Wisconsin law that had been enacted in 2008 as part a legislative package aimed at protecting trafficking victims. The law provided an affirmative defense to criminal charges for conduct committed as a direct result of being trafficked. Crystal's attorneys argued that her killing of Vola fell within the scope of this provision, that everything she had done on June 5, 2018 was a direct result of more than a year of sexual exploitation by the man she shot, and that Wisconsin law therefore provided her with a complete defense to all charges, including first-degree homicide. Prosecutions disputed this interpretation aggressively. Assistant Attorney General Timothy Barber argued that accepting Crystal's reading of the trafficking immunity law would create an unprecedented expansion of the self-defense doctrine that would effectively eliminate any requirement that a defensive action be reasonable or necessary. He argued that Crystal had gone to Vola's house that morning with a gun already in her possession. Vola had been asleep when she shot him, and that the law did not authorize the killing of a trafficker in circumstances that did not involve immediate threat to life. The question of whether the immunity provision applied was litigated through multiple levels of the Wisconsin court system for several years. In July 2022, the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled 4-3 in Crystal's favor on the threshold question. The majority held that the 2008 trafficking immunity law was a complete defense to first-degree intentional homicide, and that Crystal was entitled to argue at trial that her actions were a direct result of being trafficked. The court also held that the burden, once the defense was raised, shifted to the prosecution to disprove its applicability beyond a reasonable doubt. The ruling was immediately recognized as a significant development in the national legal conversation about how courts should treat trafficking victims who use force against their exploiters. It did not end Crystal's case, gave her a viable path to acquittal if she chose to take it to trial. She did not take it to trial. In May 2024, to nearly 6 years of proceedings, Crystal Kaiser entered a guilty plea to a reduced charge of second-degree reckless homicide. The plea agreement avoided the risk of trial on the first-degree homicide charge, which still carried a mandatory life sentence regardless of the Supreme Court's ruling on the immunity defense. Second-degree reckless homicide in Wisconsin is not a mandatory life offense. By pleading to the reduced charge, Crystal preserved her ability to argue for a finite sentence and to eventually be released. The sentencing hearing took place on August 19, 2024, before Kenosha County Circuit Court Judge David Wilk. Crystal was 24 years old by the time she stood in that courtroom. She had been in and out of the legal system since her arrest at 17. She had spent portions of the intervening years on bail, portions in custody, following subsequent violations of her bail conditions, and the entirety of the period living inside the uncertainty of a case that had swung between a potential life sentence and a viable acquittal, and ultimately landed somewhere in between. Judge Wilk sentenced her to 11 years of initial confinement, followed by 5 years of extended supervision, with credit for approximately 570 days of time already served. The net effect was a sentence that, accounting for time served, would require her to spend several more years in a Wisconsin correctional facility before becoming eligible for supervised release. The reaction to the sentence among advocates who had followed the case was divided. Some argued that any prison sentence for a girl who had been trafficked and exploited from the age of 16 was a failure of the system. The Wisconsin Supreme Court's ruling had created a genuine path to acquittal, and that the decision to plead, rather than exercise that right, had been made under pressures that were themselves a product of a prolonged prosecution no 17-year-old trafficking victim should have faced. Others argued that the plea and the finite sentence represented a meaningful resolution of a case that had legitimately complex facts, that the circumstances of the shooting had included elements that went beyond straightforward self-defense, and that the outcome reflected the reality of navigating serious criminal charges in a system that, however imperfect, ultimately bent to accommodate her history. Randall Vola III was 34 years old when he was shot in his house on South Sheridan Road in Kenosha. The Kenosha Police Department's investigation into his conduct had documented his sexual assaults on multiple underage girls and had produced video recordings of those assaults. He had never been arrested. He had never been charged. He had never appeared in court for anything he did to Crystal Kaiser or to any of the other minors his devices documented. The evidence that investigators gathered about his conduct was used not to prosecute him, but to provide context for the prosecution of the teenager he had been exploiting. He died as a person of interest in a child sexual exploitation investigation, which is a legal category that carries no consequences and leaves no public record of accountability. BMW that Crystal drove away from his house on the morning of June 5, 2018, was recovered by police. The computer she took was examined by investigators and found to contain the recordings. Recordings were entered into evidence in proceedings against Crystal, rather than in proceedings against their maker. Fire she set caused significant damage to the interior of the house, but did not spread to neighboring properties. Crystal Kaiser began serving her sentence in a Wisconsin State Correctional Facility following the August 2024 sentencing. Was 24 years old. She had been 16 when she first encountered Randall Vola on a website that federal authorities considered a primary facilitator of domestic sex trafficking. She had been 17 when she shot him. She had spent the years between those ages inside a legal process that treated her simultaneously as a victim and as a defendant, and never fully resolved the tension between those two designations. The 2008 Wisconsin Trafficking Immunity Law that her case brought to the Wisconsin Supreme Court remains in effect. It has been cited in subsequent cases by defense attorneys representing trafficking victims facing criminal charges. The ruling the court issued in July 2022 established that the law means what it says, and that its protections extend to the most serious charges the state can bring. Whether future defendants will actually exercise that right in a courtroom, given the risk that a trial represents against a potential life sentence, is a question the ruling answered legally, but not practically. Crystal Kaiser had the right. She chose not to use it. The calculation she made in that choice, 6 years into prosecutions that had started when she was 17 years old and exhausted and tired of a man who had been filming himself assaulting her since she was 16, is not a calculation anyone who has not sat where she sat is in a position to judge. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to Akron, Ohio, and involves a girl who was raped by a neighbor from the age of 9. Watched that man walk free despite DNA evidence, and was then found by a trafficker who recognized exactly what that acquittal had left behind. She was 15 years old when she was present at the event that sent her to a maximum security prison. Case 8. Alexis Martin. On a night in late 2013, a 15-year-old girl from Akron, Ohio, named Alexis Martin, was present when a man named Angelo Kearney was shot and killed during a robbery at his home. Alexis did not fire the weapon. The two men who did fire the weapon were adults. Alexis was 15 years old and had been living under Kearney's control as a trafficked child for more than a year. She had been molested in her own home before she ever met him. She had been raped by a neighbour from the age of 9 until she was 11. The man who did that to her had stood trial with DNA evidence against him and had been acquitted. That acquittal was the first time Alexis Martin learned what the justice system did with the violations committed against her. It would not be the last. The prosecution that followed Kearney's death charged Alexis as an adult with aggravated murder. She was convicted and sentenced to 21 years to life in prison. She was 17 years old when she was sent to a maximum security women's facility to begin serving that sentence. She spent 6 years there before a governor's review of her case, prompted in part by a national documentary and a public campaign supported by one of the most recognizable names in American celebrity culture, concluded that the original proceedings had failed to reckon with what had actually been done to her and by whom. Alexis grew up in Akron in circumstances that offered her very little in the way of structural protection. Her mother had a history of drug involvement that included a prison sentence for drug trafficking, and the household Alexis grew up in was marked by the instability that follows when a primary caregiver cycles between presence and absence without warning. Her siblings were in the home. The adults who were supposed to be responsible for the children's safety were not reliably present or reliably safe themselves. Alexis was, from a young age, a child navigating conditions that most of the institutions around her were not equipped to dress. The abuse by the neighbour began when Alexis was 9 years old and continued until she was 11. It was not a single incident. It was a sustained pattern of rape that lasted approximately 2 years and left marks that mental health professionals who later evaluated Alexis described as foundational to her subsequent development. When the case went to court and the man was acquitted despite DNA evidence, Alexis absorbed a lesson that the legal system had not intended to teach her, but taught her anyway. That what men did to her body was not something courts were particularly interested in stopping. She was 14 years old when she met Angelo Kearney. He was 35. He described himself as a mentor. He was attentive and present in a way that the adults in her life had not consistently been. And he directed that attention at a girl whose history of abandonment and violation had made her specifically susceptible to the version of care he performing. Kearney was not a stranger to this dynamic. He understood, with the precision that experienced exploiters develop, exactly how to position himself as the solution to a problem he intended to create more of. By the time Alexis was 14, Kearney had begun trafficking her. He and his brother were, by Alexis's account, confirmed in court documents, primary figures in her exploitation during this period. She was sold to other men for sex. The money went to Kearney. Alexis received housing and food and the continued presence of someone she had come to depend on in the way children who have been failed by reliable adults come to depend on the first person who offers consistent attention, regardless of what that attention costs them. She was a child in a trafficking situation, and she had no clear exit from it because the exit would have returned her to conditions she had already left. In 2013, when Alexis was 15 years old, a plan developed that involved robbing Kearney and his brother. The plan was not Alexis's alone. involved a female friend of hers and 2 adult men who were recruited to carry out the physical elements of the robbery. Alexis's role, described in the court documents and later in the accounts of her attorneys, was to be present and to distract another person at the scene. She was not armed. She did not fire a weapon. She did not strike anyone. She was 15 years old and present at a location where 2 adult men she had helped recruit carried out a robbery during which Angelo Kearney was shot and killed. Under Ohio's felony murder statute, a person who participates in a felony during which a death occurs can be held criminally responsible for that death, regardless of whether they personally caused it. The statute does not require that the defendant fire the weapon or intend the killing. It requires participation in the underlying felony. Prosecution in Summit County argued that Alexis' participation in planning the robbery made her legally responsible for Kearney's death under provision. The fact that she had been Kearney's trafficking victim, that the robbery was directed at the man who had been exploiting her, and that she was 15 years old, were not, in the prosecution's framing, legally relevant to her culpability under the felony murder statute. The question of whether Alexis would be tried as a juvenile or as an adult was resolved against her. A juvenile court judge conducted a hearing to determine whether she should be bound over to adult court, process that Ohio law required to consider the circumstances of the offence and the background of the juvenile. The hearing found that the severity of the charge warranted adult prosecution. Alexis was transferred to adult court, where she entered a guilty plea to aggravated murder and 1 count of felonious assault. Plea was a negotiated outcome intended to avoid the risk of a trial on charges that carried even more severe potential consequences. She was sentenced on March 30, 2015 to 21 years to life in prison. She was 17 years old at sentencing. Ohio's safe harbor law provided protections for child trafficking victims charged with crimes committed as a direct result of their exploitation, been enacted in 2012, the year before the events that led to Alexis's arrest. Her attorneys argued in subsequent appeals that the juvenile court judge who conducted the bind-over hearing had failed to apply the safe harbor law properly, that the law should have required the court to treat Alexis's trafficking history as a mandatory consideration in determining how to handle the case, and that its application could have resulted in diversion to a treatment program rather than prosecution as an adult. The Ohio Supreme Court considered this argument and upheld the conviction in a ruling issued in August 2018, finding that the trial court had not committed reversible error in how it had handled the case. The majority acknowledged that Kearney had kept Alexis as a forced sex slave, a phrase used by the Chief Justice in a written opinion, but concluded that this acknowledgement did not require reversal of the conviction under the legal standards applicable to the appeal. Alexis entered the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville following her sentencing. She was one of the younger inmates in the facility. She completed her GED while incarcerated. She became a certified vac technician at level 2. She became a certified dog trainer through a prison program that paired inmates with shelter animals and prepared those animals for adoption. Proud. She created and led support groups and programming for other incarcerated women who were survivors of human trafficking work that the facility's administration acknowledged, and that her attorneys cited in subsequent clemency petitions as evidence of the transformation she had undergone. She was, by every measure the institution could apply, a model prisoner, whose conduct bore no resemblance to the profile of someone who should spend the next 2 decades in a maximum security facility. Case reached national attention through a documentary called Kim Kardashian West. The Justice Project, produced for the Oxygen Network and aired in April 2020. The documentary profiled several cases of people Kardashian West believed had been unjustly imprisoned, and Alexis's case was among those featured. The documentary presented her trafficking history, her age at the time of the offence, the nature of her role in the events that led to Kearney's death, and the 6 years she had already spent in prison. It reached an audience of millions. Kardashian West used her platform actively in support of Alexis's release, communicating publicly with Ohio Governor Mike DeWine and his office about the case. On April 17, 2020, Governor DeWine announced that he was commuting the sentences of 7 Ohio inmates as part of a broader response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its risks within the prison system. Alexis Martin's case was among those he selected, and DeWine was specific and public about why. Host. He said at a press conference that Alexis Martin had been 15 years old when she committed her offence, that she was a child sex trafficking survivor, and that the facts of her case were particularly unique in a way that warranted executive intervention. Sentence was commuted, and she was released to a supervised group home setting where she would remain under close monitoring for an extended period. The release did not resolve all of the legal and practical constraints attached to her situation. Her parole conditions were extensive and long-running. She was required to maintain contact with her parole officer, to remain within designated geographic boundaries, and to comply with a range of behavioural requirements that would govern her life for years. In 2022, approximately 2 years after her release, Alexis was returned to prison after her commutation was revoked for a parole violation. The violation involved conduct that Middletown police documented and reported to the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. The specific nature of the violation was reported in local Ohio news coverage. She was sent back to a correctional facility to continue serving the underlying sentence. Return to prison was reported with significantly less national attention than her release had generated. The celebrity support that had attended her commutation was not replicated when the parole violation sent her back. Case moved out of the national conversation and back into the machinery of a state corrections system that had been processing her in one form or another since she was 17 years old. Angelo Kearney was 35 years old when he was shot during the robbery at his home. He had been trafficking Alexis Martin since she was 14 years old. He had been, by her account, and by the account accepted in court documents, and referenced in the Ohio Supreme Court's majority opinion, a man who had kept a child as a forced sex slave. He was never charged with any offence in connection with that conduct. He was not under investigation for it at the time of his death. He was not named in any trafficking prosecution, and any child exploitation proceeding, or any civil action related to what he had done to Alexis, or to anyone else he may have exploited. He was the victim in the criminal case that followed his death. Alexis Martin was the defendant. The Ohio Safe Harbor law that her attorneys argued should have protected her was amended and strengthened in the years following her case, part as a result of the attention her prosecution brought to the gaps in its original version. Advocates who worked on those amendments cited her case as an example of what the law had been designed to prevent and had failed to prevent in its initial form. The amended version provides more explicit protections for child trafficking victims at the bind-over stage, and requires clearer documentation of how a juvenile court considered trafficking history before transferring a child to adult jurisdiction. Whether those amendments would have changed the outcome of Alexis's case if they had been in effect in 2013 and 2014, is a question the advocates who pushed for them believe has a clear answer. The courts were never asked to test it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case travels to Riverside, California, in 1994, where a man in a red Morris Mustang introduced himself to an 11-year-old girl on a street corner and spent 2 years making her trust him before he started selling her. By the time Zara Cruzan was 16, she had been trafficked for 3 years. The sentence she received for what she did next took 18 years to begin correcting. Case 9. Sarah Cruzan. On the night of March 10, 1994, Sarah Cruzan checked into a motel room in Riverside, California, with a man named George Gilbert Howard. Howard was 31 years old. He had been in Sarah's life since she was 11. He had introduced himself to her on a street corner near her home, arriving in a red Mustang, calling himself GG, presenting himself as a mentor and a friend to a girl whose home life had given her very few of either. By the time Sarah was 13, he had begun selling her body to other men. By the time she was 16, she had been trafficked for 3 years. On the night of March 10, in that motel room in Riverside, Sarah Cruzan shot George Howard in the back of the head. He did not survive. Sarah was born in January 1978 in Riverside, California. Her mother was a drug addict who cycled in and out of the household in ways that made reliable care a concept Sarah understood mostly in the abstract. Her father was a man she had met exactly 3 times in her life, each visit brief and unmemorable, because he spent most of her childhood serving prison sentences. By the time Sarah was in elementary school, she had already been assessed by at least one counselor as a child at significant risk, a child whose home environment was not providing the stability she needed, and whose symptoms of depression were already visible. She was placed on a hospitalization hold at least once before the age of 9 for mental health concerns related to her home situation. She was, the clinical language that appeared in later court filings, a child who had been failed by every system designed to catch children like her, and who had been failed early enough that the failures had become the architecture of her daily life. George Howard found her in that architecture when she was 11 years old. He had a history with young girls from vulnerable households. He understood, with the precision that predators of his type develop over time, exactly how to present himself to a child whose hunger for stability and adult attention made her susceptible. He brought her food, he took her places. He told her she was special. He was patient. There was no dramatic moment of early violation that she would later be able to point to as the turning point. There was instead a slow process of grooming that lasted approximately 2 years, during which Howard made himself central to Sarah's understanding of who cared about her and what safety felt like. When she was 13, Howard informed Sarah that she was going to begin earning money. She would be sent to men who had paid for her company. Whatever happened during those meetings was what Howard's operation required. The money went to him. Sarah had, by this point, been repositioned so completely within her own understanding of her situation that resistance did not present itself as a clear option. Howard was the person who kept her fed and housed during the periods when her mother was unavailable. He was the person who had spent 2 years telling her she mattered. The fact that he was now the source of the harm did not make him easier to leave. It made him harder. For 3 years, from the age of 13 to the age of 16, Sarah Cruzan was commercially sexually exploited by George Howard in the Riverside area. The men who paid for her were not prosecuted. The adults in her orbit who might have intervened did not intervene, or did not know, or knew and did not act. Howard continued to operate. He had other girls. He maintained his business with the confidence of someone who had calculated correctly that the systems designed to protect children rarely reached the children who needed them most. By early 1994, Sarah was 16 years old and had been living inside Howard's operation for 3 years. What specifically accumulated in the weeks before March 10 was not detailed comprehensively in the public record. What the trial documents and subsequent legal filings establish is that on the night of March 10, Sarah went to the motel room with Howard, that she had a gun in her possession, and that she shot him once in the back of the head while he was not facing her. She then left the motel room. She was arrested the following day. The Riverside County District Attorney's Office made the decision to try her as an adult. The trial that followed lasted approximately 2.5 days. It was, by the account of every legal analyst who examined it in subsequent years, a proceeding that was structurally prevented from producing a just outcome. The jury heard almost nothing about the 3 years of trafficking. Howard's grooming of Sarah, his exploitation of her vulnerability, and the years of commercial sexual abuse were not admitted into evidence in any meaningful way. Sarah did not testify. Her attorneys did not present her trauma history as a framework for understanding why she had done what she did in that motel room. The jury that convicted her of first-degree murder heard a case about a teenager who had shot a man in the back of the head. That was the case they decided. In 1995, Sarah Cruzan was 17 years old when the Riverside County Court sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 4 years, plus a $10,000 restitution fine payable to the California Victims Services Fund. The sentencing judge, in remarks that were later cited repeatedly in clemency petitions and legal briefs, noted that Sarah had an impressive character, but that the law required the sentence he was imposing. He sentenced her to die in prison for taking the life of the man who had been trafficking her since she was 13. Frost. Sarah entered the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation at 17. She was housed at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, a maximum security institution in the San Joaquin Valley. She would spend the next 18 years there. She completed her GED. She pursued further education through the programs the institution offered. She became, over those years, one of the more visible examples in California of the contradiction embedded in a justice system that prosecuted trafficking victims for actions taken against their traffickers while declining to prosecute the traffickers themselves with anything close to equivalent energy. Her case entered the public conversation in a significant way through a short documentary produced for Human Rights Watch, which circulated online in the mid-2000s and drew attention from criminal justice reform advocates. Across the country, state lawmakers in California began citing her case in debates over sentencing reform for juvenile offenders. Senator Leland Yee, Democrat from San Francisco, made Sarah's situation the centerpiece of his proposed Fair Sentencing for Youth Act bill that would have allowed courts to reduce life sentences imposed on minors. The bill passed the California Assembly and was killed in the state Senate. On January 2, 2011, outgoing Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger commuted Sarah Cruzan's sentence to 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole. Schwarzenegger, in his statement, called the original sentence excessive, given the documented circumstances of the case. The commutation did not erase the conviction or the life sentence. It created the possibility of release. The California Board of Parole Hearings then took up the question of whether Sarah should actually be released, a process that extended over 2 additional years of hearings and reviews. In 2013, under Governor Jerry Brown, Sarah Cruzen's charges were reduced to second-degree manslaughter, and she was released on parole after 18 years of incarceration. The conviction itself remained on her record for another decade. On July 1, 2022, Governor Gavin Newsom issued Sarah Cruzen a full pardon. In his statement, Newsom wrote that Sarah had committed a crime that took a life, that the pardon did not minimize that fact or forgive the harm it caused, that it did recognize the transformation she had achieved in the years since. Since her release, Sarah has worked with organizations and focused on the rights of trafficking survivors, and has spoken publicly about the gap between how the justice system treats victims who fight back and how it treats the people who exploit them. George Gilbert Howard had been under no formal legal scrutiny for his trafficking operation at the time of his death. He had groomed and exploited at least one child, and by the account of people who knew him, likely others. He had operated for years in a community where the structures that should have identified and stopped him had not done so. Motel, where he was shot in Riverside, has changed hands several times in the decades since. The street corner where he first pulled up alongside an 11-year-old girl in a red Mustang is an unremarkable intersection in a mid-sized California city. There is nothing there to mark what started on it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case ends differently from every other case in this video. It ends in a Texas courtroom with a jury that deliberated for 8.5 hours and came back with not guilty. The girl was 17. She had fired 6 times at her father in his kitchen, and she walked out of that courtroom free. Case 10. Donna Wisner. On the evening of May 24, 1991, 17-year-old Donna Marie Wisner argued with her father Glenn Wisner in the kitchen of their home in Tyler, Texas. The argument was about her job, a set of car keys, and her boyfriend. None of those things were the real subject of the argument. Real subject had been accumulating since she was 2 years old, and on the night of May 24, it finally ran out of room. Glenn threw Donna against the wall and struck her head against it repeatedly. He then turned on her mother, beating her until she was unconscious on the floor. He threw Donna out of the house. She stood outside in the dark for a period that the trial testimony did not measure precisely, and then she went back in. She went to the bedroom. She took a loaded revolver from the nightstand beside her parents' bed. When Glenn came at her again, she fired 6 times. He did not survive. Donna Marie Wisner was charged with first-degree murder in Smith County, Texas. She was 17 years old. Case that followed did not become a national story because of the severity of the sentence she received. It became a national story because of what happened at trial, because of the law that made her defense possible, and because of what that law said about how long Texas had been failing children like her. Glenn Wisner had been abusing Donna since she was a toddler. The abuse was physical from the beginning and escalated steadily as she grew older. He threw oak logs at her to register displeasure. He handcuffed her to a chair for what those who later described his behavior at trial characterized his own amusement. He sent her lewd valentines. He subjected her to what she described as rub-downs that crossed into sexual abuse as she entered teens. He beat her mother. The household operated under a system of violence so normalized that Donna had, at one point before the night of May 24, placed a gun in her own mouth in what she described as an act of despair, and been discovered by her father, who told her to do it right next time. That detail appeared in a 1992 Time magazine account of the case, and was later covered in a 60-minute segment that made Donna Wisner's story familiar to a national audience. It was the kind of detail that sits outside any ordinary framework for understanding childhood. It was also the kind of detail that the Texas legal system, prior to September 1991, had no formal mechanism for placing before a jury in a homicide trial. In September 1991, approximately 4 months after Glenn Wisner was shot in the kitchen of his Tyler home, and roughly a year before Donna's trial began, the Texas legislature passed a new law. The statute permitted a person accused of killing a family member to introduce evidence of prior abuse committed by that family member. It also allowed for expert testimony on the psychology of abuse victims, including children who had grown up in violent households, what some researchers were beginning to call battered child syndrome, by analogy to the battered woman syndrome that had been litigated in spousal homicide cases for the better part of 2 decades. Texas law was the first of its kind in any American state at the time. No comparable statute existed anywhere else in the country. When Donna Wisner went to trial, her attorneys moved to use the new law as soon as it was enacted. The defense they constructed was built on the premise that what had happened in that kitchen on the night of May 24 was not premeditated murder, but an act of self-defense by a young woman who had spent 15 years inside a household where violence was the primary language her father used, who had tried and failed to find exits from that household, who had reached a night when no exit presented itself except the one she took. The testimony at trial came from Donna and from her mother, whose name appeared in coverage of the case as Mamie. Mamie Wisner described the years of abuse from her own perspective as Glenn's wife, corroborating the pattern of violence that Donna had described, and providing the jury with an account of the night of May 24 that matched her daughter's in its essential facts. Glenn had beaten her unconscious. Glenn had thrown Donna out of the house. She had not seen what happened after that because she was on the floor. Expert testimony on battered child syndrome explained to the jury how a child raised inside sustained violence internalizes a different understanding of threat and danger than a person who has grown up in safety. Tunn says the standard legal definition of self-defense required a reasonable perception of imminent threat at the moment of the killing. The expert testimony argued that for a child who had lived inside chronic violence for 15 years, perception of imminent threat was not a momentary judgment made on a single evening. Continuous state of awareness, shaped by a decade and a half of evidence about what Glenn Wisner did to the people in his house, and what he capable of doing next. The prosecution argued that Donna had not been in immediate danger at the moment she retrieved the gun and fired. Prosecutor Rod Boyles presented the case as a homicide rather than a defensive act, pointing to the sequence of events. Glenn had thrown her out of the house. She had chosen to return. She had retrieved the weapon, and she had fired. The choice to return, in the prosecution's framing, disrupted the chain of imminent threat that self-defense required. The jury deliberated for 8.5 hours. They returned a verdict of not guilty. It was the first acquittal in a Texas homicide case under the new prior abuse statute. The defense attorneys and legal observers who had followed the case understood its significance immediately. Texas had created a legal mechanism that acknowledged something the law had previously refused to formally recognize: that the experience of growing up inside sustained abuse produces a psychology that cannot be evaluated by the same standards applied to a person who has never been trapped inside that experience. The law did not excuse the killing. It required the jury to understand the context in which the killing had occurred before deciding whether it constituted a crime. The case was covered nationally in ways that went beyond typical crime reporting. the 60-minute segment that aired in November 1992 framed it as part of a broader examination of parricide by abused children, and brought Donna, Wisner's acquittal, to an audience of millions. The Time magazine piece published around the same time placed her case alongside others from across country, cataloguing the range of outcomes for young people who had killed abusive parents and noting the wide disparity between states that had begun to create legal mechanisms for abuse evidence and states that had not. In some of those other states, children who endured comparable abuse and taken comparable action were serving decades in prison. Donna Wisner was 19 years old when the 60 Minutes segment aired. The trial was behind her. Glenn Wisner had been buried in Tyler. Her mother had survived both the years inside that house and the night of May 24. What Donna did with the years that followed was not extensively documented in the public record. Not did become a public advocate in the way that some of the other women in this video did. She did not write a memoir or found a non-profit or appear at legislative hearings arguing for legal reform. She went home to Tyler. That, after everything, was what the acquittal had made possible. The Texas law that saved her from a sentence of at least 30 years went on to influence the development of similar statutes in other states. Legal scholars who tracked the expansion of abuse evidence provisions in homicide trials in the years following 1991 cited Texas as the pioneer, and Donna Wisner's case as the first proof of concept. Battered child syndrome framework that her defense attorneys introduced to a Smith County jury in Tyler became a recognized element of homicide defense law in jurisdictions across the country. Over the 2 decades that followed, argument that juries needed to understand the psychology of abuse survivors before evaluating their actions had to start somewhere. It started in a Smith County courtroom with a 17-year-old girl who had fired 6 times at a man who had been throwing oak logs at her since she was old enough to walk. Glenn Wisner was in his 40s when he was shot in his own kitchen. Revolver Donna used had been kept on the nightstand beside his bed. He had beaten his wife unconscious that evening and struck his daughter's head against the wall. He had sent her lewd valentines. He had handcuffed her to chairs. He had told her, when she held his gun to her own head in despair, to do it right next time. The jury in Tyler heard all of that under a law that had not existed a year before the trial began, and they acquitted her after 8.5 hours. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.